Let's move on to some other news for you now. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed off on a law which declares that 18% of Ukraine is now Russian territory. That's despite the fact that Moscow's forces don't fully control the 4 regions they now claim are part of Russia. In fact, Russian troops are currently being forced to retreat on 2 fronts. And in recent weeks, Ukraine has recaptured, hundreds of square kilometres of its own territory. Meanwhile, officials in Kyiv have dismissed this move by Moscow, this signing into law of the absorption of that territory, as being meaningless. They say the law that President Putin has signed isn't worth the paper it's written on. Well, let's get more now, and we can cross to Washington and speak to Russia expert Anna Borshchevskaya, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and thank you for bearing with us while we listen to President Biden there. What's your understanding, first of all, of what the latest progress has been by the Ukrainians in their counteroffensive?
Sure, it's a pleasure to be on your show. My understanding is that the Ukrainians are making strong headway. Really, if you look at the events of the last several weeks, we've seen the first successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, and they've made a number of tactical gains, such as capturing certain strategic roads or blowing up certain strategic bridges in Kherson to complicate logistics for Russian troops. So in that sense, it has been encouraging.
And given what you've just said, and given what we've been reporting, which seems to correspond with what you've just said, how does Russia think it's going to annex territory that it doesn't even control?
Well, first, Russia still retains control of a number of territories. Still, if we think back to pre-February 24th of this year, right, Russia controlled approximately 7% of Ukrainian territory. It still controls more than that. And so if you think about it from that perspective, if you also look at the partial formal mobilization, I want to say stress formal because really informally mobilization has been going on. Russia has made gains in terms of controlling Ukrainian territory since the invasion. And certainly there are a lot of questions to be asked about just how much this mobilization is going to necessarily help. But that said, simply throwing more manpower, even if untrained, will prolong the war. We're now looking at the winter when the weather gets cold. And it's clear that Putin is in this for the long haul. So we're still looking at protracted warfare.
We heard President Putin speaking today. He said the situation is soon going to stabilize. I don't know if understanding Russia helps you, and the Russian language helps you to decrypt what he actually said and what he actually meant. What do you think he meant?
So my initial, I want to emphasize, my initial reaction is Putin has been looking for a while now, really to take a tactical pause, and the having to resort to formal and partial mobilization really seems to have changed those plans. I think that Putin had been pressured by internal forces within his own regime to announce formal mobilization because Putin knew what a backlash it would cause domestically, but he must have been convinced that there was no other way to press on to win the war. But having said that, I suspect that message is simply about, again, some kind of a potential tactical pause with the aim of ultimately regrouping, thinking for a way to gain another strategic advantage. Again, I still think he's committed to the long haul, so it's important to keep helping Ukraine as we have been.
Indeed. I mean, clearly, President Putin has massively underestimated the Ukrainians and their Western allies. Does that leave him looking slightly vulnerable in his own country, do you think?
Well, certainly there are a lot of, it certainly does raise his vulnerability level. Again, I think I think he has more to fear from his own internal regime forces, which tend to be even more hardline. They've been calling for full mobilization for many months now. In fact, if anything, they wanted more. Basically more war crimes, essentially, more violence. And so in terms of domestic protest, what you're seeing, Russians fleeing as much as they can. But when it comes to his own regime, it does raise certain questions. Having said that, it's still early to tell.
And if we rewind to February of this year, I remember being in the studio with a history expert, and we listened together to President Putin's address to the nation, and he seemed to be setting out his plans for this so-called special operation, which by then wasn't called a special military operation. It was just before that was unveiled. But do you get the impression that the average person in Russia does buy into Putin's understanding of Russian history, and therefore what he's doing, in their view and in Putin's view, is simply taking back what is historically Russian territory? Is that a widely held opinion?
Yeah, and this is this is always a tough question to answer because we don't really know the Russian public opinion. But having said that, again, keep in mind it is difficult to do accurate opinion polling in an authoritarian country. But having said that, I do think there's a significant, perhaps a slim majority of Russians who do buy into pieces of this narrative and who are expressing support for something. In other words, not necessarily war, but there is some kind of a rally around the flag, sort of support your country feeling. So this view, these ideas that Ukraine is not a real country, that it's not a real nation with its own separate identity, it is a widely held view. It's not simply Putin alone.
And just lastly, I know you've got to go. It's just my last question. If you had to second guess Russia's next move, what would you say?
Well, I'd say, first of all, I think the nuclear threats are probably going to continue. I would also simply expect more fighting as the weather gets colder, which is a shift from what I think Putin was trying to do earlier, which is, again, try to look for a tactical pause with the aim of taking a breather.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Anna Borshchevskaya, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.